So, hi everyone, it's Nina Collins here at the Wolfer, and I'm here today doing an author interview with Gina Frangello, who's just published a book called Blow Your House Down, with a great subtitle, A Story of Family, Feminism, and Treason. Couldn't sound like a more Wolfer book. The publicist wrote to me and she was like, "You must be interested in covering this book." I was like, "Why, yes, we are." It's just come out and it's already been in the Times. There was a really, really cool excerpt in the Times. I would imagine that made you super happy.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. So welcome, Gina. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So where are you? You were just about to say you're in the California.
Yeah, I live in Chicago full time, but because my husband and I are all working virtually and going to school virtually and have been for over a year, we decided to come out to California near the Joshua Tree area where my husband has had a little place for like 20 years. And so we've been out here for about a month and we're about to go home.
Good. It's heavenly there. We actually had a Wolfer retreat there a couple of years ago, Joshua Tree. I'd never been. It's beautiful. It's like surreal. Yeah.
It is.
All right, so this is a memoir about divorce and about middle age and about caretaking, and you had breast cancer, and the impetus for the story, at least the way it's framed, is your best friend had died at around 43. So it's really, again, very applicable to our audience. It's a memoir about kind of midlife explosion.
That would be apt.
Essentially. So I think to start, it would be helpful if you would just tell our readers, our listeners a little bit, like, what's your background as a writer? What led you to write this book?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I am normally, when it comes to books, a fiction writer. I have 4 books of fiction. I've been writing since I was about 4 years old, but my first novel came out when I was 37, and I did 4 novels between then and 2016. But during the events that were taking place in the book, so the divorce, the breast cancer, the all of these things exploding at once. My father had just died. I found that I was not really able to write fiction. So normally my fiction writing brain takes up a big part of my consciousness. I'm always spinning ideas, and it was just dry. Like I'd have an idea, but I'd have no incentive to write it. I was just sort of really in this tunnel of what was going on in my own life, of just all these different things that were happening at once. And so I started writing about some of those experiences, just kind of in secret for myself. But meanwhile, I had long had sort of a vague plan to do an essay collection about caretaking my parents. My parents were very eccentric, kind of amazing people. And I had written a lot of short form essays about them. So I decided, well, maybe I'll put that together because I've written a lot of the pieces already. Maybe it's almost done, I thought, but it was nowhere near done.
Yeah, of course.
Right. When I put all the pieces together, I saw there were really a lot of repetitions because each essay had been self-contained on its own. So I ended up cutting about half of them, cracking open the rest of them, and then adding in a whole bunch of other things, including some of what I had been writing privately that friends started encouraging me to embrace as part of the story.
Mm-hmm. So what's really interesting to me about it, and first of all, it's written in the second person. Like, was that a decision?
So no, it's the whole book is not written in the second person, but it plays with point of view at various points. So, so the opening chapter actually begins by referring to me as for adulteress,
right?
And sort of in the later parts, there's a section where it says A is for accountability, and it says essentially that like the math of accountability means that A plus A plus A plus A can never equal I, and I shift to I at that point.
Right, that's right.
And then at other points, I play with point of view again. There is some second person in one chapter about my youth, where I transition from second person to first person and kind of look at my past from both lenses. And then there's also another section in the book that's written in the form of direct address, kind of in dictionary form.
Yes, I love it. Well, so that's that's what I was about to get at. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean that it's all written in the second person, but the structure is really unusual. And as someone who writes myself, but has not written nearly as much as you have. I'm always really impressed when authors can pull it off. I mean, like there's a section called the cartographers,
Right.
50 meditations, right? And then there's of course the beginning chapter, which is called the story of A, where you riff on all words that begin with A. A is for anti-heroine, A is for antecedent, A is for Alice. Like I just love and then you kind of lapse into kind of more straight memoir, but you do often do you're talking about yourself as a you as opposed to I. So it's just incredibly creative. Oh, and there's a section where you a short dictionary of mutually understood words, where you create words like what an affair bubble is, or caregiver fatigue, or so I really appreciated it as a book that is I mean, I related obviously so much to it. I also had infidelity at the end of my marriage, and um, then there are ideas about just being a bad woman that I found super interesting. Um, let's see, wait, I have a quote here where you said, the idea that women have to be miserable to matter was interesting to me. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's in a section called Substitute Beauty, in which I go back to my childhood, to sort of look at the formation of my sexual identity, my friendship identities, but primarily my imagination and the role that it played in sort of at times avoiding my own life, avoiding looking at my own life, by living so heavily in my imaginative writer
In
mind.
fiction.
And yeah, but I I used second person in that piece, initially as a way of, you have to externalize yourself as a character. When you're writing memoir, it's really hard at times not to feel like you have to absolutely represent every single thing that ever happened, which then
Yeah.
becomes, impossible and unwieldy. Or, also at times self-censorship and feeling like, oh my God, I cannot write this. And so at times the experimentations with point of view really liberated me to be able to sort of see myself as an external character and to develop myself in similar ways that I would to a fictional character
Yeah.
in one of my novels,
Yeah.
which would tend to be more ruthlessly, I mean,
Yeah.
not with less protectiveness.
Well, it probably helped you having been a fiction writer, because I've struggled with that myself. I have one book that I wrote about menopause. It's a kind of like funny aging book. But then I have another memoir that I never sold, that where I really struggle with being an unlikable narrator. And I talk
Oh,
about my adultery. And so I really relate. It's interesting the way you played with it to give yourself more freedom. Um, And do you think, I mean, when you in that section where you talk about women have to be miserable to matter, you're talking about writers like Jean Reese, writers I love, right? Like Jean Reese and Sylvia Plath and I don't know, Kathy Acker. I can't remember who else.
right. And even film like Thelma and Louise, the sort of fetishization of the hysterics in a lot of feminist theory, which,
Yeah.
I've been fascinated by. I've been a student of that and a scholar of that for many years. And so it's not really in any way meant to bash any of those writers, most of whom I love, and the films, but just to sort of realize how many forms of art end with women essentially going off the cliff, as in Thelma and Louise, or committing suicide, or having some other, disastrous thing befall them whenever they've stepped out of line. And that history, which began in the hands of men,
Yeah.
obviously,
Madame
men were the
Bovary,
ones, right?
Anna
And
Karenina.
but continued when women began writing our own stories. And I think there were a lot of very solid reasons to sort of show that in the culture, when you step out of line, particularly obviously in the past, sometimes really, it was a matter of kind of life and death, and there wasn't any coming back for you. And then there's also, the idea of kind of like burn it down. So a lot of feminist narratives have ended in kind of, fire and disaster for the woman, almost as a mode of rebellion. But did start to really interrogate that in my mind, because in all the things that I had read or seen about adultery, but also about a lot of other things that women may do that they're not encouraged to do, it seemed as though there had to be a tragic ending, and that women are often filtered. Actually, Leslie Jameson has written about this as well, really eloquently. I think she had a piece in the New York Times. I can't remember exactly where it was. After I'd written the book, and I was like, yes, this, where she talks about sort of the fetishization of unhappiness and just sort of self-destruction among women.
Yeah.
And when I was in my 20s, I mean, there's just absolutely zero question that I completely bought into that mythology. Like, my fictional characters tended to be highly self-destructive with terrible outcomes happening at the end. Someone disappears, blah, blah, blah. And, I was passionately committed to those books and viewed them as feminist, but it's taken me to middle age to ask why feminism doesn't allow for more happy endings for women. Not simplistic happy endings. Oh, I got married, I had children, all problems were solved, but the ability to reinvent your life and to reforge your life after catastrophic events.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, do you feel in your own experience that you're having, we're not at the end yet, right? You also say death is the only true ending in your book, which
Right.
I love that line. And that's certainly true. But are you having a happy ending right now? I mean, I actually feel at 51, like I'm having a pretty happy ending moment right now. Like, I went through a lot of misery and anger, and I've written about it, and violence and adultery and depression, and that stuff for the most part feels like it's in the rearview mirror for me, gratefully. What about you? I mean, what's happened to you?
Definitely. So, I mean, obviously, I strongly believe that there isn't an ending in nonfiction, right? There's just a last page of the book,
Yeah,
because unlike a novel, it's
right.
not a
Your life
self-contained
is
world.
continuing.
You continue, to go on.
And the way you look at it, sorry to interrupt, but and the way you look at it later is going to change. Like, you'll read this book in 10 years and you're going to see it differently.
Absolutely. There's
Yeah,
no question. Our
yeah,
positionality, where we're standing, it makes every difference in what the outcome is of a book, right?
yeah.
And I talk about that in the book. I mean, I had originally intended to end it with the death of my father, which happened very shortly after I had left my marriage, when things were still very up in the air between myself and my then lover, now husband. My children were really struggling. A lot of things were going on simultaneously. My father had just died, but my mother was also very sick. My divorce was turning contentious, etc. And I loved initially the idea of leaving kind of like our protagonist, me, just hanging out there with no, like, we don't know how the story's going to end.
Mhm.
But so many things began to happen in quick succession after that, my cancer diagnosis and a bunch of other things that felt like such a part of this story, because bodies and middle-aged women and sexuality and how
Cool.
we view people who are ill and all of those
Mhm.
things that started to enact in my own life felt like part of the story. And one of the byproducts of that was that I ended up with a much happier ending, romantically speaking, and with regard to my kids and my family, than I would have been had I left myself hanging
And
out
you
to
left
dry
it
in
there.
2015. But I also am really careful to try to point out to the reader not only that this story is still evolving because I'm a real person,
Mhm.
but also that it could have had a different ending at any various point.
Absolutely. I mean, you
You have
could have,
right,
right.
you have different choices, and then in hindsight, you would think those choices had been the ones that led you to where you were supposed to be. And so we all kind of we make a choice, and Kundera has this great line where he's like, we can't live two lives and decide which one would have been the better course for us. We only have the one. And so I made certain choices, and this became the path that I was on. But there is certainly no question that I'm in a much better place now than I was
Sure.
those years ago.
So that makes me want to read Kundera again. He's such a writer of, like, age 20, right? Like, I loved him when I was 20. And I don't think I ever revisited him, but I remember the passion I had for his work then. What's that line again? Say it one more time.
So I don't have the exact quote, but it's when Tomas is considering whether or not to let Teresa stay with him in Unbearable Lightness of Being.
Yeah.
You know, Kundera, who's always the editorial omniscient narrator of most of his books, says, you know, well, unfortunately, we don't have two lives to compare side by side. We only have the one, and then we have to go with, you know, what happens there. So,
a good thing to remember. It's because, you know, when you have kind of middle-age regret, which I have, you know, this is it. I did it the best I could. This is what it is. And here I am.
Right.
Yeah.
If you could go back, I mean, there's a lot of things that, you know, there are a lot of choices I would have made differently. And I have to hold that truth simultaneously with the fact that I also am where I want to be now.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
you know, and that both things can be true. You know, it can be true that I would not do the same things again exactly as I had done them, but I am happy in my
Here I am. Yeah. And also I try and have sympathy for my younger self, which is hard, but I wonder, like, I have two questions now. I wonder, and for anyone who's dropping in now, we're talking to Gina Frangello about her book, Blow Your House Down, which has just come out, a story of family, feminism, and treason. I wonder what you're hoping readers will take away from the book. And I'm also wondering, since the events in the book are like kind of 5 or 6 years ago, I am wondering that question of like, distance from your story and how you're feeling about regret and sympathy and yourself as an unlikable narrator, or like all those things, because they're complicated.
They are complicated. I mean, I I think, as I was saying, I wrote the book because I needed to write the book, but I published the book because I really did feel that women, middle-aged women, women who have made mistakes, women who have been caregivers to their parents, been in the sandwich generation, have had infidelity or divorce, or have been ill, have lost body parts, have been in chronic pain, like all these different things, death of parents, death of friends. Like, there are not enough memoirs that address the middle-aged woman's experience. There are so many amazing memoirs by women, and many of them are written when the women are middle-aged, but they tend to focus more on sort of, you know, like the explosions of youth, you know, the coming of age, and you know, the misspent 20s and all of that. And then, you know, there is this tacit assumption, I think, in publishing that, you know, then you stop having a complex inner life at a certain point. You know, you get married, you have children, you turn middle age, and there's the slow erasure of women from the discourse, you know.
There was the Claire Dederer memoir, which really
I
annoyed
love
me.
that book.
Well, I really liked it because she's a good writer, but I actually felt really annoyed because I felt like she probably fucked him and she didn't. I was just really annoyed. I was like, really? You didn't sleep with him? Like, it was just, I don't know. She's a very good writer.
I will say, of course, I have no inside knowledge that Claire did blurb my book. I asked her because I loved Love and Trouble, and I loved the way that it's a holistic narrative but told in different styles, which was the same thing I was doing. But I do feel like it's entirely possible in the publishing industry that, you know, if that were to have happened with Claire or other writers and they actually put it in the book isn't as likely to sell or do well.
Successful. Yeah. I felt like her book, the writing was beautiful. I really admire her. Everyone, that's called Claire Dederer, For Love and Trouble.
Love and Trouble.
And it's a memoir about a woman who almost has an affair. It's kind of a midlife memoir about a woman who, but I really felt like it was kind of whitewashed, but I could be totally wrong. Who knows?
I mean, I can't speak to that with regard to, you know, to her personal experience, but I definitely can speak to the fact that I think publishing encourages women to whitewash their stories and to ultimately reaffirm, you know, heteronormative marital fidelity, and sort of the woman coming to her senses, right? And it's like, if she doesn't go off the cliff, she comes to her senses, and those are like the two options. You know, you burn or you go back to, you know, the status quo. And I really feel like there's a third way, you know, and a fourth, fifth, and eighth, hundredth way that
our lives are messy.
Are leading our lives, right? And so, you know, I just didn't feel like there were books speaking to my experience. Claire's was one of the closest. You know, when I was going through these things, I was desperate to read memoir that would speak to my experience. And I found even when I was writing about things like breast cancer that were not like my fault, like having an affair, that that even writing about things on Facebook about my breast cancer or showing myself bald or talking about my bilateral mastectomy, I would get letters from women who were like, I haven't, I haven't told anyone at work. I've tried to write about this, but I feel too ashamed. I feel like people are going to look at me differently because there's such, a compulsive idea that only youthful, fully able, beautiful, healthy women matter in our culture.
Yeah.
And also, matter largely in ways that they can then be exploited and sort of fetishized. But it's sort of like once you're not in that box anymore, you're just not even interesting, but here we all are leading these lives that are still exploding, that are still evolving, and we're not seeing ourselves in literature. I actually think this is one area in which television, like cable shows and so forth, are ahead of the curve of literature.
It's really starting. Yeah, no, it's starting to get really good. There are a lot of great women. Have you seen Last Tango in Halifax? It's my favorite.
I have not.
It's on, I think Netflix or Amazon, but it's about these two women in England and their parent. Anyway, there are a lot of good middle-aged women. Or The Split is another good one. Nicola Walker, also English. Yeah. So it sounds like one of the things you hope readers will take away from this book is kind of comfort at not being alone, like seeing themselves.
Just being seen, just being like, this is not only you. And also, while my ending is in no way a fairy tale ending, but also just the hope that, the world can be burning around you, but the only guarantee in life is change, and you will not always be in that place, and you can keep going, and you can be forgiven, you can do your best to forgive yourself and others. And that ultimately, I mean, while it's not in any way a self-help book, and I'm not meaning to be inspirational on any level, I just wanted other women to see a lens through which, like, you're allowed to keep going and have a worthwhile life, which is a privilege I think we have always granted to men. Men are allowed to burn things down and then start again, not without anyone giving them any blame, but they're not expected to then just writhe eternally in self-loathing or stay static or never accept themselves. And so I really wanted to put a book like that out into the world, along with other women who I think are trying to put books like that out into the world right now, and for other women to have hope from it, and to feel like I'm not the only person who's had these feelings or who has done these things or has had these conflicts or maybe didn't always feel 100% charitable about having to take care of my parents and their bodily functions, even though I adored them, and all of these things, so but definitely, and part of the whole thing we're talking about, there is this hyperbolic push in the publishing industry for women to be likable and inspirational, both in fiction and nonfiction, I think. And so I've always liked writing about messy characters who are not traditionally sympathetic in my fiction. And it took me a while to, I guess, accept that, like, now that was me. I was that.
I've reached the age where I'm super messy and complicated and
exactly. And that you're writing to certain people who need to hear this, but you definitely also know that there are going to be a bunch of other people who are like, I didn't want to hear this, you suck, and accepting that that's okay.
Yeah, you just have to open yourself up to that. I mean, I have to say, your book, your story, it's a very you probably don't know anything about the Wolfer community, but it's a social platform that I started a bunch of years ago on Facebook, originally called "What Would Virginia Woolf Do?" And the kind of
I remember, yes.
The joke was like, should we all just kill ourselves because we're getting older? And really, our kind of mission, I think, is to make women realize, like, and kind of smart women who want to kind of make fun of ourselves and big readers, and kind of help us all realize that we're not alone, and that's exactly what you're doing in a very smart, interesting way. Because the book is also just really, really, really well done. I mean, I think I think structurally the way you play with stuff is just genius. It's
Thank
not
you.
a standard memoir, and it's beautiful. How did you get Charlize Theron to give you a quote?
So I mean, she's amazing. She has optioned two of my novels. Um,
Ah, nice. Okay.
and one of them is no longer under option. It didn't really go anywhere. But A Life in Men, my third book of fiction, is still under development, and it's got some people attached to it. It's got scripts. It's
Great.
it's
Yeah, I
still
know
in
how that goes.
process.
Like, I
So
always
yeah, so
that's great.
she's been kind of in my life. Denver and Delilah's been in my life since about 2014. And so, I was afraid to do it, but I was like, will she blurb the book? And she did,
Yeah, I
so
mean, when I always remember when she did was that movie Monster? Like, ever since
yeah.
then, I will totally admire her, and it seems like a kind of book that she would relate to. So I'm
Yeah,
glad.
I agree. I mean, she's been definitely like a very strong kind of feminist icon for it, in the film industry for sure.
Sure. Yeah, she's really interesting. Didn't she like witness her mother's murder? I think she has like a weird, tragic. Yeah, there's some background with Charlize Theron.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, and you also have a quote from Lydia Yuknakovich, who's a
Right.
wolfer, who's also a big fan of my mother's writing. My mother was a writer named Kathleen Collins.
Oh,
Anyways,
wow.
Lydia is amazing. So,
Lydia was my editor for my first novel.
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, yeah. She used to run a really small indie press, as I did, and we were in kind of the same community. And in 2004 or so, I had a literary agent who just kind of like disappeared off the scene. All the clients were left floundering, and my book had been being shopped by him, and so it was sort of like I couldn't really find a new agent to shop this book that had already been seen by certain places,
I
and
know it
so.
well. I used to be an agent, so I know that problem.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, so I just was like, I was running an indie press at the time, and I was basically like, screw this. I'm just sending it to some indies that I really love. And I sent to Lydia, and she accepted the book 3 days later. So
Oh, that's amazing. What a nice story.
yeah,
I'm trying to think,
she's wonderful.
who was the agent who disappeared?
Bill Clegg.
Oh, right, because he went off a cliff, right, and then
Yeah,
became
I
a
think
huge.
he's back. I mean,
Yeah,
he's obviously
then he
like,
came back as a hugely successful literary writer. That's been a kind
right.
of amazing story. Good
Yeah.
for him. All right, well, it's really, I feel like in another world, we would already like long know each other. We know a lot of people in common, and you're definitely Wolfer material. So I'm very glad to have had this conversation. So everyone, I really suggest you check out Blow Your House Down, A Story of Family, Feminism, and Treason by Gina Frangello. And yeah, thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
for having me.
Have a good weekend and good luck with your book. And we'll stay in
Thank
touch.
you so much. Absolutely.
All right. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.